Hi, I'm Rachel Morez, and we are going to be exploring trait theory, with a focus on the theory that is being used most currently, which is the that was a 10, five factor model, or also called Ocean. Okay, so here is our overview and our learning outcomes. So we're going to be talking about like what is trait theory? What is the purpose of it? The key terms and concepts, the importance in communication, the development of trait theory, the overall strengths and weaknesses of it. And then when we focus on our trait theory, we're going to be looking at the five-factor model, which is also called Ocean, the key terms and concepts, how it works, those strengths and weaknesses, and two communication traits. So, let me get my reading glasses because isn't that what happens when you turn 35? Okay, so what is trait theory? So, communication is a behavior, and all behaviors are a form of communication. So, we try to figure out like what makes people behave or communicate in a specific way. And most of the time we're just like, well, that's just how they are. Like that's just their personality. Like that's just them. But when one wants to truly understand behaviors or like either of your own actions or of somebody else's, that is where we use trait theories. Sorry, me. Um, Trait theories assume that there are specific aspects of human behavior that remain relatively constant, for an individual across like time and all situations. So somebody that would use this repeated or expected behavior, this trait, to describe that person. So an example would be somebody who's always like kind or thoughtful, no matter what is happening, no matter what is the situation. They could say, oh, that person has the trait of kindness and thoughtfulness. That person is kind and thoughtful. So, traits are relatively stable over time and within situations. They're unique to each individual. Many individuals share the same traits, but they differ in the different degrees and expressions. So you could have two individuals that might be described as talkative, but one individual is just going to be doing the talking most of the time. Um, so like when it comes to like me and my husband, like I'm the one who's talking most of the time, so I'm considered more talkative. Well, because I am. But regardless, and then you have somebody else who is like talks non-stop. Like you cannot get them to stop talking for anything, like a motor mouth. Both individuals are seen as talkative, but with different degrees of intensity. Most importantly, though, traits do influence behavior, thoughts, and emotions across different situations. So, being able to recognize your own traits as well as those of others allows one to more accurately predict an individual's response and increase a positive outcome for all interactions in communication. So, trait theory in communication refers to the idea that communication styles and behaviors are largely influenced by an individual's inherent personality traits, or one's personality type. In other words, one's traits or personality type shapes the way somebody communicates. It's how they craft and deliver a message and how one responds to the message being received. So, for an example, am I talking down to you? Are you open to what I am saying? Am I open to what you're saying? Or am I shutting down? Am I becoming argumentative? Um, am I nodding my head to say, like, yeah, I'm listening to you? And are you responding the way that you always do? So, psychologists early on began looking for ways to increase effective interactions and communication, and how to explain and describe behaviors by first looking at traits individually and then grouping them together to form super traits or personality types. These findings were then used to develop a super trait model to explain personality differences. And these super trait models were then further developed, expanded, or refined to predict the effect on behavior, interactions, and communications. So I just put up here like the difference between traits and super traits. So your traits, they're stable, they're consistent, they're enduring patterns of behavior, they're seen as biological in origin. They vary by individual and they vary by intensity. So an example would be somebody who is kind, fun-loving, shy, rude, you know, um, versus a super trait is a common individual traits that are clustered together as one trait or a personality type. So your individual traits that are clustered into super traits are then called a personality type. So an example of that would be somebody who is social, somebody who is talkative, somebody who's outgoing. Those are your personality traits. But altogether, you would be like, that person is an extrovert. Like their personality type is extrovert because they are social, talkative, and outgoing. Does that make sense? I know this is a recording, but if it doesn't make sense, let me know. So here is our development. We're going to look at the development of trait theories. They originally started looking for ways to increase effective interactions and communication to explain and describe behaviors. How they did this was by looking at individual traits. Then they made those into super traits, remember? So our traits become super traits, and then they identified them as a personality type. Why did they do this? Like, I mean, we're trying to explain how personality develops in a person. We're trying to figure out personality differences. So that's why. So, one of the first psychologists that helped lay the foundation of trait theories was Gordon Allport in the 1930s. He was hoping to explain how personality developed. He called his theory trait theory. He was known as a trait psychologist, and he stated that individuals have predictable habits or traits that are unique to them. Um, sorry, I'm not laughing. I'm recording in my bedroom and I can hear my 4-year-old screaming how he's done in his bath because my husband's trying to keep them occupied while he leaves. Okay, anyways. All right, he identified 4,500 traits that could be used to describe individuals. And then he organized these traits into 3 levels: your cardinal, your central, and your secondary. A cardinal is your dominant trait. Not everybody has one of these. But if you do have a cardinal trait, um, it is so dominant that it is like that is singularly described um for that person. So for example, it would be Hitler. Hitler was ruthless. Like that's all he is. Like when you think of Hitler, like what is the one thing that you think of? And that would be his cardinal trait. Um Then you have your central traits. They are your basic foundation traits of a person. So most of us have between like 5 to 10 traits that describe how you are. That could be seen as friendly, caring, fun-loving, shy, rude, anything. Like you have like 5 to 10 traits. And then you have your secondary traits. Your secondary traits are seen in situations that may contradict one central trait. So for one example would be somebody who's like super easygoing, like laid back, like just a chill person. They might get anxious in a crowd and they're not able to handle like extreme situations in that sense. So those are the 3 levels of traits. His work was criticized because there was too many traits. Again, he had 4,500. So there was too many traits and too individualistic versus the contribution that he did provide though was the 3-tiered hierarchical system. So then moving on into the 1940s, you have Raymond Cattell. Um, he took Allport's list and compressed his traits into 16 traits. So he took his 4,500 traits and now we got 16. And he called those source traits. He identified traits such as social boldness, warmth, rule conscientiousness, emotional stability, apprehension, etc. And then he developed a questionnaire. He used factor analysis to identify underlying personality traits. Then the participants rated themselves on these 16 traits. A low score on an item was a negative level, like moody, while a high score on an item was positive, like calm. The underlining personality traits he then identified resulted in the five global factors. You have your openness or mindedness, openness, tough-mindedness, self-control, extroversion, independence and accommodation, or anxiety. Um, his research also led to conclude that two-thirds of characteristics of personalities are determined or influenced by the environment, and one-third on hereditary. A major contribution of Cattell was his use of the factor analysis, which allowed him to find common patterns and relationships among the data and identify groups. His results were considered more scientific because now the traits could be measured. In his questionnaire, the 16PF is still used today, even though his theory was still considered too complicated. Then, starting in the 1940s through the 1970s, we have Hans Eysenck's work on traits and behaviors, which was very popular. Unlike Cattell, he believed that one's personality was governed by biology and that his personality traits are products of the brain and the result of genetic factors. He expanded on Cattell's work. He also used factor analysis to measure the traits through an inventory and questionnaire. But he only identified three core personality traits. You have your extroversion, your neuroticism, and psychotism to explain personality and behavior. Oh, not that last part. Okay. So one's personality could range within the personality dimension depending on the situation. So a contribution of his work on behaviors, or it was his contribution was his work on behaviors. Okay. He was especially interested in criminals and psychopaths and what their personality, what traits made them behave the way that they did. And this is why psychotism was added as a dimension. And a criticism of his model is that it's too narrow and limited. Okay, so let's review real quick. Allport was all about individual traits. It was, he took 4,500 into three levels. Cattell's 16 traits were divided into five global factors. While it was deemed too complicated, Eysenck's three-factor model was considered too narrow and limited. So that brings us to the 1980s with John Digman and his five-factor model. This was developed by John Digman and is one of the most popular trait factor models today and considered the most accurate. He stated that clustering traits together into super traits would more accurately explain personality differences and behavior. He identified five general factors: openness to experiences, conscientiousness, extrovertedness, agreeableness, and neuroticism. That's where we get ocean from. So, oh, here it is. So here again, here's your, oh, y'all can't, I'm like trying to show y'all. If you look on here, here is your openness to experiences. So you're being curious, you're reflective, you're data driven, your conscientiousness, you're organized, self-discipline, you like to you complete your tasks. Extroversionness, you're sociable, you're assertive, you're talkative. Agreeableness is cooperative and sympathetic. And neuroticism, you're vulnerable, you're unstably emotionally and anxious. So let's look at this. Um, Each of these factors, though, they do contain two opposing sides of character traits. So, for example, you have your um extroversion is the opposite would be an introvert. So you're more reserved. You have your agreeableness versus somebody who's disagreeable. They're rude, they're antagonistic. Um, your conscientiousness versus impecunious. Okay, so if y'all watch Bailey Sarian, this is like my Bailey Sarian moment. I have practiced that word a bajillion times and I still can't say it. But that is somebody who is impulsive or they're careless. Your neurotism versus self-assured. Um, so those people, they're a little bit more self-confident. And your openness versus somebody who sticks to routine. They prefer something that they already know. So between these two extremes, there are also secondary traits that are considered positive and negative. So, this is how it works. A participant will complete the questionnaire, such as a 16 PF, about their behavior, preferences, motivation, and emotional response. Their answer choices correspond to personality traits. The answers are rated high if more points and low if fewer points. So an example would be high points for openness. Openness means you're more likely to be curious and reflective and less likely to stick to routines. The five-factor model is noted for its accuracy and predicting personality and personality traits. And despite its popularity and continued use today, though, it's noted um, as being criticized for overly simplified. So, in the context of communication, there are two personality traits that are most often researched in communication. Um, and they are argumentativeness and communication apprehension. Because they hinder effective communication. So Dominic Infinite and Andrew Rancer, they are these communication scholars, and they define argumentativeness as a positive trait. Um, that is your willingness to engage in conversation about controversial topics, to support one's point of view, and to effectively refute opposing beliefs. By using the five-factor model, they identified argumentativeness as a combination of low neuroticism, high extroversion, low openness, low agreeableness, and high conscientiousness. They found that argumentativeness is associated with better communication skills, more creative problem solving, and more effective leadership. However, they do note that this is not the case across all cultures. They find argumentativeness and assertiveness as a positive trait, while aggression and hostility are negative traits. And not everybody is going to agree with this. So you have your communication apprehension. This refers to a degree of anxiety associated with oral communication. This is a persistent and extreme fear of communicating across a variety of settings. And in some cases, individuals may not only communicate when absolutely necessary, greatly affecting their quality of life. Using the five-factor model, Infate, Infinite and Rancer identified communication apprehension to be a combination of high neuroticism, low extroversion, low openness, low agreeableness, and low conscientiousness. And most would agree with this finding. James McCroskey, a communication scholar, and his colleagues have studied CA and other related constructs such as willingness to communicate, shyness, talkaholism, and communication competence. He found that CA more often stems from the fear associated with scrutiny and negative evaluation. He also identified the fear of failure, of the audience, of high stakes, and of being the center of attention. Anxiety builds over what may or may not happen. Your heart rate can increase, you can blush on your face and your neck. And so avoidance and escaping would be the only things that somebody can think of. More research is needed in order to understand CA and how to address it. So, with all theories, there are strengths and weaknesses. So, here are strengths and weaknesses. So, um, your overall strength of trait theory is you have the ability to categorize observable behaviors with repeated action of the individual over a prolonged period of time. Common actions were noticed. So one is more able to accurately predict an individual's response. Trait theorists also came to similar specific sets of traits that could be identified, such as Eysenck's extroversion and neuroticism, Cattell's extroversion, anxiety and openness, and Digman's extroversion and neuroticism. Trait theory can also be applied to different fields like psychology, leadership, customer service, and obviously, of course, communication. And current research also indicates that personality traits are significant predictors of social behavior. The overall weaknesses of trait theories is uniform reactions are not probable. They don't always take into account context or the situation and the shaping of the behavior or the outcome. An example would be like an easy laid back mom um, would become a mama bear when her child is threatened. Might know from experience. Participants are self-reporting when completing inventories and questionnaires, so there could be some self-bias there. Also, at the time, emotions could be involved as well when you're answering these questions. And there's no way to explain why one behaves one way over time, but has a different reaction when given the same situation at another. So maybe like one day somebody is like so excited to find a dollar, and then like the next day they find a dollar and they're like, yeah, that's cool. First of all, that's weird. Like, how are you finding all these dollars? But you know what I mean? Like, they are most a theoretical and non-explanatory. So, and then trait theories tend to describe what, but very few have attempted to explain the why or the how. So, that is trait theories and the overall viewpoint on that, as well as your five-factor model with which is Ocean. Now, if you are curious about your own personality type, I have also included a very brief version of the Big Five personality inventory. Um, so I mean, like I said, like it's brief, it's short, just a little quick, like, hey, like I want to know what I am. So there's that. Okay. Good luck in this course. I hope that I explained that well enough for you. Okay, bye.